Should I be facing this way or this way?
I think, let me see, we're going to have to be somewhat close to the machine.
Okay, so maybe kind of where Chris is.
Well, why don't I move this so it's a little, maybe I can stretch it over there. No.
You perceive any patterns?
Or the Campanile dog music.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, a lot of people walk in step with
Chris,
it.
can you just do some analysis?
Yeah.
Like walking with their phone, which I definitely do too sometimes. It's just like, your steps
I think most people are okay, yeah.
yeah, no, they're probably have like
Yeah.
So that's surprise for you.
I just stayed in here. I was discussing with Chris. I didn't even make it up there.
Oh, okay, got it. Were you perched out on the window?
That was group.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no, I was just literally like standing there on the whiteboard and we were discussing dimensionality with Chris and how I feel like I'm limited in terms of the dimensions that I can perceive, and like in dimensions of anything, like just multitasking, thinking of like multiple things at once. It's hard for me. Like it's hard to concentrate on like things and different things that are going on.
Yeah,
like,
same.
even conversation-wise, right? Like it's impossible to perfectly repeat two conversations that you're hearing at once, or like perfectly actually focus on them. And so, I was wondering, like savants or like people who are like autistic, who are like crazy skilled at something, do they have to reduce dimensionality because they seem to not be able to cope with simple things like social interaction, right? That's like too much for them already. So the question is like, do they have even less dimensionality as normal people, or do they have actually even more? Because they're able to do so many things at once. Like, is that, does it demand like higher dimensionality, or is it actually reduce? And so they can sort of like get much more of the working memory of the RAM, all that into like one problem and solve it very efficiently, or is it that they actually split it up and they do it in
hard problems, but not the
or like basically do they perform these hard tasks by splitting them up and doing things in parallel, sort of as if you had like different processors, they were all doing similar or different things at once and then sort of constructing it in the end, or is it that they have like one big supercomputer where they only focus on one dimension or one mode, and then they do that super efficiently.
While we set up, does anyone want to
very
kind of reflect on your experience outside?
We didn't get to anything either. It's just fun to talk about this. It's what the whole class is about, is like kind of asking questions that is now differently about.
People's walking habits and kind of way when he was like hitting hair and like I thought of like when we close our eyes, when we get those like fireworks, like I want to know why we start to see stuff in those patterns.
So are you questioning whether the potential relationships you saw outside were something you kind of constructed, or?
I don't know, just maybe what, I don't know, like maybe first of all where the signal's coming from when you close your eyes like that, and where patterns may or may not emerge.
So what generates patterns, be it outside or in the eyes?
Okay. So here. This is the situation.
What else did anybody think of or find?
I found that I felt really weird because I knew I was watching with people, so I felt like everyone else was watching me. I knew all the cats was up there.
All right.
For me, it was really interesting. I felt like I also just found more different law. And then you can see like leadership like this
I asked what time we were supposed to come back. In the interest of
I like a response. So I was sitting up here in the window watching all of you. I noticed one pattern in particular, which was as soon as everybody found their spots and stopped or stood or sat down, everybody crossed their arms.
It's cold out there.
That might be
no longer noise.
That was one of the things that I noticed in all of you, is that a lot of you crossed your arms. Right?
It's not the best contact because we just broke that.
thinking and I shouldn't take out my phone or some of you did.
What about people's behaviors? Like the people that you saw walk by, like what kinds of states of mind were they in? How were they interacting with their world?
Yeah, so initially I thought, like there's different structures which I could use to, I guess, think of patterns. Like one would be, should I look at the outside environment, should I look at the people? And then, so initially I decided to focus on the people. And I felt like the people could sort of, in some sense, be put in like different categories. Like there would be one group that's like doing something with their phone, either texting / on the phone. There's one group that you can, like all these, individual people walking, like trying to get somewhere. You can sense that, that they have somewhere to be. And there's another group which seems more like they don't really have somewhere to be, they're just kind of walking. Then there were like groups of people, it's like 3 or 4 people walking together. And what I kind of noticed was that as the groups got bigger, it seemed like the people in the groups were, like, in some sense, smiling more, and like, because there was like more to talk about, and like people respond, and so it's kind of like a spectrum. So from an individual, generally like you wouldn't see them smiling or laughing too much, but if it's like a group of 2 or 3 or 4 people, I would see like a smile, and often like a bigger smile if the group was bigger. That's what I think.
Cool. Yeah, so I mean, one kind of difficulty in this kind of exercise is that we are both kind of the subject and the object. Like we're in such familiar territory that it's very easy to file things away into certain categories. And so to be able to make observations like this, it actually takes a lot of effort to step out of this role as a subject of the world. Next week, in fact, we're going to do some meditation. We're going to have a very experienced meditator come in. And I think one aspect of meditation is very much also about examining different patterns that we find to be very familiar. Okay, so what is happening right now is that Krish has this EEG, which is picking up brain waves from different points in his head. Each one of these little green circles is picking up the averaged electrical activity from one glob of brain region that happens to be sitting right underneath this electrode. And so, there's some very obvious limitations of these kinds of technologies. So the skull being a really big one, the fact that these signals have to make it through this really thick, kind of not very conductive substrate. Also, you're picking up one signal from like millions of neurons that are talking at the same time. So imagine like going into outer space, sticking a camera towards Berkeley, and trying to do the kind of analysis that we just did. It would be very, very hard. And yet, what people see is that it produces certain patterns, certain rhythms, depending on what state the subject, your Krish, is in. And so what we're going to be seeing is to what extent he can control the kind of directions in which his brain floats in whatever space is connected to the patterns of his waves.
So you'll see that.
And Rich is right now training him on how to communicate with this device. So just like in Shannon's approach, you have a sender and a receiver, you need to establish a language that links the sender and the receiver. Right now what's happening is the computer is learning what it means for Krish to push, what it means for him to pull. Because every person's brain will presumably have a very different way of representing these concepts. And so they're kind of creating a language right now between the device and its brain waves.
I'm just curious if you know this. Do EEGs pick up activity from the cortex mostly? Do they know which neurons are like?
Yeah, so they
seem like that's the case because they're closer to the surface, but I don't know. Is that the case?
Yeah.
Especially the way they're positioned right now.
Yeah, so the main things that the EEG picks up on in this configuration, as far as I know, are cortex and the muscles on top of the scalp as well. And so these are two signals that this equipment is very sensitive to, both of which produce these electrical discharges. And so that also raises the question, what about all the things you don't detect? So for example, it only detects certain orientations of neurons. They have to align in a certain way for them to produce fields that this equipment can detect. There's all kinds of things, there's all kinds of blind spots. But if you remember that very densely interconnected network that I showed you earlier inside of a cell, the argument is that if you get certain vantage points in this very highly coupled network, if you can see certain people moving around, you can tell what's going on in the whole. Because when you have a very dense network, every node talks to every other node.
Can you pick up the homuncular projection on like the corresponding part?
So that would be a little harder.
Probably not.
So with that, I think I'll hand it over to Rich.
So this is basically linking the EEG to a music system that is sounding quite noisy right now, and that was sort of what I was hoping to be the case, because the idea is through biofeedback training you get a much better level of control over the music that's being generated. So what was it? Chris. What Chris was doing right now is re-evoking a train of thought that we had him sort of focus on for 10 seconds. And you can see that as a red bar here, which is the cognitive state, and the more strongly he's pushing, the higher that red bar is going to go. And that is generating stochastic musical material that's based on certain rules. It's harmonically related, so it's never going to sound sort of wrong. But it's going to sound kind of chaotic for a while until you start to learn to be able to modulate the power of the train before. So initially, this will spike quite significantly. Most of the time, it'll kind of shoot up to 100, go back to 0 again. And over time, you'll learn to be able to control it to different levels of accuracy, 50%, 75%. And that has obviously musical implications in terms of how much material you want to generate at a particular time during a piece of music, whether you want it to be calm, whether you want it to be frenetic. And so that's the sort of the control aspect of the musical material. And the beat that you're hearing is mapped to the emotional state. So the emotional states are being read out here. There are many more that can be detected by the emotive hardware, but we've just chosen the most robust of the three, which are frustration, excitement, and meditation. Now, frustration is 100% of the time the one that we see the most of, because people have this thing on their heads, and they're like, what the hell is this thing on my head, and why is it broken, and well. But there's a lot of confusion. There's also probably a lot of artifacts that are going on at the same time, because there's a lot of sort of frowning and kind of neuromuscular activity going on. So we see this going, up to the top, at least to begin with. But the idea is to sort of modulate those states and ultimately gain a control to allow yourself to get into a meditative state, and at that point the beat will change to become more identifiably chilled out. The beat, as you can hear it right now, is the beat itself is noisy, so it's crossing over between time signatures. It's on a loop, so the beat is on a loop. The musical material is being generated not on a loop. And the idea behind the frustration loop is that you can't determine where the beat is, where the strong beat is, so it's frustrating. So one of the interesting aspects of this is how much you're able to get yourself out of a particular kind of state of frustration, for example. How do you sort of bring yourself out of that very chaotic, disordered state? And how do you sort of bring yourself into a level of control over the system? So, Chris, I'm curious as to are you finding yourself able to control the push elements of the red bar? Not as much as the That's often a good one. Captain, you can probably speak to why physically imagining, a movement is a good, strong sort of signal generator. Have any thoughts? Yeah, the noise. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I actually don't have a good intuition for why that would be a good signal. Perhaps it's something that is very enveloping, like it involves thinking of your whole being going somewhere, but I don't know. Yeah,
Okay.
it's an interesting question.
What's the size of the motor cortex compared to the other cortices? Because maybe it's just size-wise more, and so it's picking up more electrodes. If you think of like doing a movement,
Yeah.
maybe your brain area, your representation of your motor cortex might just be much larger, and so you're like kind of, it's more weighted that way.
Yeah, I mean, this is the sensory motor rhythm, right? So you activating your visual and motor cortexes. You imagine moving and imagine seeing food. So it's a stronger signal overall. That's totally possible. So okay, so now I'm going to remove this because it's probably kind of uncomfortable. And thank you for being here and subjects. All right. So yeah, thanks very much. So in terms of signal noise, as we could hear there, it was a very noisy environment. It was hard to determine exactly what was going on, probably for all of you, and I imagine just as much for Krish. Let me just stop this from going for a second.
How long does it take for an average user to transfer game control?
I have to say that I've never found out, unfortunately, because in many situations when we're showing this and people are using it, it's usually in a very chaotic, frenetic, busy context where people have 5 minutes to try it, and it's we haven't done any sort of longitudinal testing or like significant testing for people getting a significant level of control over the system. But as a composer, I mean, this is something that's quite interesting for me because in building the system, I was doing a lot of sort of self-testing of how the signals were responding to what I was doing. But at the same time, I was sort of building it as I went, kind of intuitively, and so for me, I have a pretty strong level of control over the system, but that's partly because I sort of built it at the same time, so I'm kind of in it. Yeah.
I was wondering about how you generate the emotional comparisons, and I did something similar to this in my physics class. I built an EEG and then associated different tones to different frequencies. So I'm wondering if you pull the meditation and relate it to alpha waves and the amount of alpha waves you have, or excitement to the amount of beta waves.
So yeah, the signals that we're getting from the headset are pre-filtered, so it's not raw. So they are pre-processed on the first layer of software that you saw. So we're just getting processed data. So it's kind of a black box in that respect. Like meditation will. What does that mean? It probably means something different to the manufacturers of this hardware as opposed to another headset, and the people who develop the software. But generally speaking, having spoken to people in the community, the understanding is that these emotional states are a combination of the band power frequencies, the alpha, beta, etc., and also some neuromuscular activity, some sort of GSR-based activity, and it's a combination of those signals together that they're kind of saying, okay, that is frustration, that is meditation. But it's somewhat subjective at the same time. There's no definitive. I mean, the data is the data, but when the way that you label it is completely. It's sort of completely up to you. You can call it frustration. You can call it mild annoyance, or and what do those labels really mean? That's an open question.
Can you calibrate it for every person? Because you train Krish on at least pushing and pulling, right? Can you calibrate it on emotions too? Because I guess it's hard to like be frustrated on the point, but could you maybe imagine like a layer of that? Because then it would be more of a personalized sort of state of meditation or frustration or any of those.
Yeah, so at least with the system that I'm using, it's there's the ability to create a profile of the person using the headset. So that's the idea, is to create a profile of the brain activity, and so that when you switch to that profile, the AI in the software is sort of saying, oh, okay, that's you. You respond in this way. These are your signatures, and so otherwise it would be a very frustrating task, because every time it would be just like the first time again, and and there's no sort of incremental learning there. So yeah, so I guess to contextualize a little bit why this is sort of interesting in terms of signal to noise. I mean, sure, obviously there's the meditation aspect of we all have very busy lives, we all have very busy brains, and the ability to be able to filter out the inessential and filter out filter out the noise from your existence is something that I'm personally sort of very interested in exploring. And what are the best mechanisms for you to do that, to achieve that clarity? Many meditators will meditate in silence. Other meditators will meditate in a club. It really depends on what your definition of clarity is. I certainly have my clubbing experiences where I completely feel as clear as I've ever felt and as calm as I've ever felt, even though it's a hot, sweaty box of a night and it's 4 in the morning and all of those kind of things. So to connect it to the reading, people have very, very different ideas of what noise is. And if you look at John Cage and his perception of the organization of sound, and you compare it to someone like Luigi Russolo, who wrote his manifesto in 1867 called The Art of Noises, and he was called a futurist musician, and he wrote this manifesto about how the Industrial Revolution that was happening at the time was generating this entirely new world of sound, and he sort of considered it to be music. And of course, he was probably the only one at that time who considered this to be music. Who considered it to be some kind of sound that could be organized in some way. To everybody else, it was this cacophony that had never existed before. I mean, that's the thing on the planet. The only noise of this kind of magnitude that existed before the Industrial Revolution was waterfalls and tectonic shifts and naturally occurring phenomena. So suddenly, there are all these noisemakers, and composers sort of immediately started asking questions about, well, this has totally exploded our world of what is considered signal and what is considered noise. And Cage, in his various different explorations of what organizing sound means, and particularly with his piece 433, which I'm sure you've all listened to in some way.
Listen to it right now.
Has everybody listened to 433?
Well, we got a performance.
Well, it's interesting. Which performance did you listen to? Was it David Tudor at Woodstock, or was it I don't know, Takegawa in the Place Rouge in 2007? Actually, interestingly, when the piece was performed in the premiere at Woodstock, the musical establishment was incensed by this. It was completely incensed by this idea that this was music, that this was considered organized sound. And one of the artists stood up at the end of the piece, and it was a Q&A, and they said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I think it's time to run these people out of town." So So it got quite a visceral reaction. I kind of find that reaction to these groundbreaking pieces very, very interesting. Similar to sort of Stravinsky, in the Rite of Spring in Paris, where it's a beautiful opera and opens up and there's this lovely bassoon line going da 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 da. You think, everybody sat there and they're in their safe zone in the opera house because they know what they've come to see. It's a ballet. It's going to be very beautiful. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, there's just an entire orchestral unison comes in, and it's totally atonal, and it's totally arrhythmic, and it just suddenly goes dun 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 dun, and they rioted. There were people beating each other over the head with canes and umbrellas. And it was a complete chaotic scene. And this was because people just had a very sensory reaction to what they were hearing that they had never heard before. Suddenly, they were being told that this was music. They were being told that this was music because the composer was saying so by having it performed, by having it presented. And they couldn't handle it. However, interestingly enough, time went by and people got released from jail and whatever for rioting and breaking property, and they sort of came to their senses a little bit, and then they started to take a different view of what they had just heard, and to such an extent that the following year, there was a reprise of the Rite of Spring at the same place in Paris Opera, and Stravinsky was carried out on people's shoulders as an avant-garde hero of the next generation of composers. And so it's just interesting to see that dichotomy between this is not music, it's just insolent noise, and then you couldn't imagine life without it suddenly. And so I'm very sort of intrigued by that notion. So let me just go back to oh yeah. So some other composers that are actually very interesting to look at. Again, playing with this idea of signal versus noise. One person in particular, he's at Wesleyan, and his name is Alvin Lucier. Has anybody heard of Alvin Lucier? Okay, yeah. So you probably know what I'm saying. Yeah, exactly. So similar to the Diana Deutsch. It was Diana Deutsch, right? It behaved so strangely. Yeah, auditory hallucination band. Alvin Lucier was very much of a pioneer in exploring what music sort of really means, and what our sound world is kind of made up of. And he created a piece some years ago, some decades ago, called "I Am Sitting in a Room." And it's a piece that lasts. It can actually last any amount of time. I think that the one that I connect with is about 45 minutes long, and it's a piece of text that starts along the lines of, "I am sitting in a room, not very much different from the room you are sitting in now, and the sounds that you are hearing are my voice being recorded and played back into the room. And as you listen to my voice being recorded and added together," it's along these lines, I can't remember it verbatim, but you will find that the words lose their meaning and they have no connection to what went before. It's along those lines. And so the text is read, it's recorded, it's thrown back into the room, it's added to itself, so it's this kind of cumulative effect. And the text is about half a minute long, so it might be recorded 90 times, played back into the room, and what ends up happening over a period of time is that the characteristics of the room itself, the resonant frequencies of the room, start to modulate the sound, such that two things happen. Firstly, all of the formal information, all of the semantic information that's carried in the text is lost. And secondly, the resonant frequencies of the room are changing the nature of the rhythm of the sounds that you're hearing. So it becomes a completely different experience. And interestingly, and I've listened to it a couple of times this way. I'll spin on from minute 1 to minute 25. So minute 1, it's a completely coherent piece of text. You can understand exactly what's being said. And it goes to minute 25, and suddenly it's a piece of music. It sounds like music because you've lost all of the speech, and all that you're hearing is the tone. And the tone, because it's being added up upon itself, the timbre of the tone becomes darker and darker. And as you spin on further into the piece, the resonant frequencies of the room start to modulate that tone itself, and you start to pick up on those rhythms as the walls start to effectively modulate those frequencies that are very, very, very thick by this point. So that's definitely another interesting, I would say, experiment on how habituation is an important part of our listening experience. Part of my work as a composer for children's toys is very much involved around voiceover direction. So I will be directing voice talent to deliver lines in the way that I think that they should be said. And I've experienced on more than one occasion being in a recording session, and my OCD sort of kicks off, and I say, well, that inflection wasn't quite right. Can we have a bit more of a cadence here, please? And so they'll repeat the phrase, touch the red button, touch the red button, touch the red button, touch the red button, touch the red button. And we'll go on like this. And on the 19th or 20th take, where everybody's just fed up with me at this point, we don't even know what we're saying. We have no idea what this alien language is. And, so habituation is a very interesting phenomenon. And part of my role as a composer, as a sound designer, is to be dispassionate about those situations where something is strikes your sense as sounding good or bad, whether it's noise or blissful harmony, and to identify the reasons why something might be considered to be noise in a certain context or be considered to be music in another context. But essentially, John Cage, I think, was sort of right that everything is music, ultimately. It just depends on how you organize it and how you perceive it and understand it. So I think that's mostly what I have to say. So I'm open to any questions about any of what you've read with Credo, which I think is a very interesting text. So one of the interesting things about that text was the fact that it was written in 1937. So it was written a very long time before a lot of what was presaged in the text actually came to be. So he presaged sort of electronic music. He presaged the idea that people would start making sound with every different kind of material available, and this idea of replicating what had gone in the past, using synthesized methods, sort of creating keyboards that would, essentially play music in a very sort of 18th century way was going to go out the window, and that's exactly what happened. So I'd be interested to hear anyone's thoughts on his thoughts. Yeah.
I actually have a question.
Sure.
So maybe I'll wait. Does anyone have?
Did everybody get the in-joke in the text? There was a little in-joke. It's just in the format. It's a very Cage thing to do. So the signal, ostensibly, of course, is the lowercase text, right? And the noise is this. The noise is this uppercase that's kind of suddenly coming out of nowhere and just kind of yelling at you. Maybe it's the other way around. Maybe that's the signal, and all the rest of this lowercase stuff is noise.
you know, it's an open question, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, so earlier we were talking about how looping things turns noise into signal in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering how you think the increase of looping in music, because we're creating it digitally now, and we'll often take a little drum loop and repeat it forever. How do you think that it has changed music or changed the experience of listening to music, if at all?
Yeah, it's all gone terrible, hasn't it? No. That's not fair. I mean, I'm using looping myself, so I can't say anything. I think there are, as with anything, there are good ways. There are good approaches and there are bad approaches, and there are in-the-middle approaches. And I think that there are some people who are doing phenomenal work with loops to the extent that some of these loops may be, 100 of a second long, and they're using these, and they're building these loops up into these very, very structured textual sort of compositions. I think that the idea of repetition is something that it's been definitely a 20th century. It was very much of a 20th century phenomenon. This idea of sort of what came out of recording studios and the Westdeutsche Rundfunk school of Germany in the 1940s, where music was suddenly seen to be, or the organization of sound, I should say, was suddenly seen to be this experimental pursuit that was almost like a science, and the technologies that became available allowed composers to be able to really kind of delve into the minutiae of how you can manipulate sound. And out of that came, several decades later, music production and DJs, dance producers. That sort of came directly out of those labs when they were no longer labs, and they were kind of saying, well, we've got all this expensive equipment. What are we going to do with it? Okay, well let's make dance beats.
But yeah, on that note, like we've certainly had a lot more of the drum loops and the repetition, but because of that, we've been forced to explore a lot of new sounds. You can find music nowadays that even though it's got a repetitive background, perhaps, there's so many like interesting just noises that they put in there that it develops into something of its own.
Yeah, so there's a composer who's based out in Pacifica. His name's Kim Cascone. He was the sound designer worked with David Lynch for a long time. And he wrote a paper some years ago called The Aesthetics of Failure. And what he was talking about was all of those sounds which are unintentional. It's not a perfect performance, it's not a perfect recording, and how that imperfection makes it more of a perfect recording. Out of that